All right, time to go teach. Hello and welcome to this next episode of Tutors, where we are continuing through biochemistry, and today we are going to be looking at how atoms interact. So for the day, targets. First, summarize the different ways that these different atoms can interact. Atomic interactions are going to be crucial in our understanding when we get to cells and how the cells are actually able to generate life. So hopefully after today, you'll be able to explain some different interactions that atoms can have with each other. Next is compare the four main elements in biology and how they interact and some of the properties that they have. So only 2 learning targets for the day. And again, remember that atoms, they're the building blocks of everything, and there are different types of atoms, that is our elements, and elements are going to be able to come together and interact with each other, and that's going to be what makes molecules, larger sort of building units. And those molecules can either be in straight or branched or ring shapes. So if it's just in a sense a straight line, we call that a straight molecule. If all of a sudden it branches off, we call it branched. And if it is a cyclical molecule where the molecule will wrap around, then we would call it a ring. And looking at this, the interactions between these different atoms are going to be called bonds. So these interactions are bonds. That is a strong interaction between the different atoms. So the big idea here is that atoms, they can bond together to make unique, larger structures with their own unique properties. And those things are called molecules. And the bonds, they come in 3 types: ionic, metallic, and covalent. Now in biology, we focus mostly on the covalent bonds. So when we're going to be looking at bonds in a little bit, we are going to be looking at and focusing on covalent bonds. That's where elements share electrons. If the elements share 2 electrons between each other, then that would be called a single bond. If 2 elements share 4 electrons between each other, that would be called a double bond. It's where we count it as 2 bonds. And if they would share 6 electrons between the 2 elements, then that would be a triple bond. And just like you would probably expect, a triple bond is the strongest of these bonds. Double bond is in between, and a single bond is the weakest of the covalent bonds. But each of these bonds are extremely strong. A bond is an extremely strong interaction between 2 elements. And different elements are able to form a different number of bonds based upon the amount of electrons that they have. If an element only has 1 electron, like hydrogen, well, it can only share 1 electron. And so if another element shares 1 electron with it, that means that we are sharing 2 electrons total, which would mean that it could form a single bond. But that's the extent of it. Hydrogen has no other electrons it can share. So once it has shared its electrons, that's it. It can't share them multiple times. It can only share them to form 1 bond. So when we look at hydrogen, carbon, nitrogen, and oxygen, it's extremely important that we understand how many bonds each of these elements can make. First, hydrogen. As I said, hydrogen only has 1 electron, so it can only share 1 electron. That means it can only make 1 bond. It shares 1 electron, another element shares 1 electron, so they each share 1, that counts as 2, and there is our single bond. Carbon, though, it has 4 electrons that it can share individually. And because of that, that means it can make 4 bonds. Okay? Hello. I wanted to take just a second out of the main video to explain something that I just said that might cause a little bit of confusion. In the last video, you might remember that I said that carbon has 6 electrons. And that's true. But just a couple seconds ago, I said carbon has 4 electrons that it can share. And that's also true. Not all of the electrons that carbon has are electrons that it has the ability to share. Only 4 of those electrons are able to be shared. And so, even though it has 6 electrons, only 4 of the electrons are what we would call bonding electrons. From this point on in this video, I'm only going to be referring to the bonding electrons. So when I talk about the electrons in nitrogen or the electrons in oxygen, again, I'm only talking about bonding electrons. The other thing that I want you to be aware of is that in this video, you can see that I show 4 bonds coming off of the carbon atom, and those 4 bonds are all flat. That's just the nature of this medium. But the reality is that the bonds are not flat. This is a 3-dimensional structure. And it looks something like this. When carbon makes 4 bonds, the carbon atom would be in the center, and the bonds would all come off of that carbon atom. And it forms this shape, which is called a tetrahedral. Each of the bonds are an equal distance away from each other. So no 2 bonds are closer or farther apart from each other. They are all equal. And it doesn't matter which way you orient it, they are always going to be the same distance away from each other. Now that we've gone over that, let's get back to the main video. So carbon is able to make 4 bonds because each one of its electrons can pair up with an electron from another element and be shared between the two, and that means that it can make those 4 different bonds. But it doesn't have to make 4 single bonds. Carbon has some options. It can make, like we have here, 4 single bonds, or it could make 1 double bond and 2 single bonds, or it could make 2 double bonds. Or carbon can even make 1 single bond and 1 triple bond, noticing that carbon will make 4 bonds. So hydrogen always makes 1 bond, carbon will make 4. Moving on, nitrogen, well, it only has 3 electrons that it can share. So it can make 3 bonds. You knew exactly where I was going. Or each one of those electrons can pair up with an electron from another element, and then you can have that bond. So, nitrogen can form 3 bonds. But it doesn't have to, again, form 3 single bonds. It could form also 1 double bond and 1 single bond, or it could form 1 triple bond. Again, nitrogen forming 3 bonds always. So nitrogen is going to want to form 3 bonds. Carbon, 4. Hydrogen, 1. And now we get to oxygen. Oxygen has 2 electrons that it can share. 2. And that means it can make 2 bonds. So oxygen is going to be able to make 2 bonds. It can make either, like we have here, 2 single bonds, or, as you are probably already ahead of me on this, it can make 1 double bond, and that's its limit, oxygen making 2 bonds. So again, remember, you do need to know this. It's really important that you understand the number of bonds each of these elements can make. Hydrogen always makes 1 bond. Carbon is going to make 4 bonds. Nitrogen makes 3 bonds. And oxygen makes 2 bonds. That's going to be extremely important for you to understand as we progress through and start to look at some molecules, and you're going to see how the different elements are arranged. You need to understand how many bonds they can make. So in summary, atoms, they form bonds in extremely specific ways. And those specific ways are going to be important when it comes to building molecules. So that's why we look at this. And each of the 4 main elements in biology, they form a different number of bonds. Hydrogen only forms 1 bond. Carbon forms 4 bonds. Nitrogen forms 3 bonds. And again, oxygen forms 2 bonds. That is what allows for all sorts of differences between them. It's going to allow for these elements to come together and build different molecules, which in turn build all of the things that are living. And that's just awesome. So, on that note, be awesome, stay awesome.